Hi guys. So, today we are reading The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Today we're reading chapter 9, Barrels Out of Bond. The day after the battle with the spiders, Bilbo and the dwarves made one last despairing effort to find a way out before they died of hunger and thirst. They got up and staggered on in the direction which 8 of the 13 had guessed to be the one which the path lay. But they never found out if they were right. Such day as there ever was in the forest was fading once more into blackness of night, when suddenly out sprang the light of many torches all around them, like hundreds of red stars. Out leapt wood elves, with their bows and spears, and called to the dwarves to halt. There was no thought of fight, even if the dwarves had not been in such a state that they were actually glad to be captured. Their small knives, their only weapons to be at hand, would have been of no use against the arrows and the elves that could hit a bird's eye in the dark. So they simply stopped dead and sat down and waited, all except Bilbo, who popped on his ring and slipped quickly to one side. That is why, when the elves bound the dwarves in a long line, one behind the other, they counted them. They never found or counted the hobbit. Nor did they hear or feel him trotting along well behind them, their torch lit as they led off their prisoners into the forest. Each dwarf was blindfolded, but that did not make much difference, for even Bilbo, with the use of his eyes, could not see where they were going, and neither he nor the others knew where they had started from anyway. Bilbo had all he could to do to keep up with the torches, for the elves were making the dwarves go as fast as they ever could, sick and weary as they were. The king had ordered them to make haste. Suddenly the torches stopped, and the hobbit had just time to catch up before they began to cross the bridge. This was a bridge that led across the river to the king's doors. The water flowed dark and swift and strong beneath, and as far end were gates before the mouth of a huge cavern ran into the side of a steep slope covered with trees. There the great beeches came right down to the bank, till the feet were in the stream. Across the bridge the elves thrust their prisoners, but Bilbo hesitated in the rear. He did not at all like the look of the cavern mouth, and he only made up his mind not to desert his friends just in time to scuttle over at the heels of the last elf before the great gate of the king's closed behind him with a clank. Inside the passages were lit with red torches lights, and the elf guards sang as they marched along the twisting crossing and echoing paths. These were not like those of goblin cities. They were smaller, less deep underground, and filled with cleaner air. In the great hall, with pillars hewn out of the stone sat the elven king on a chair of carven wood. On his head was a crown of berries and red leaves, for the autumn was once again. In the spring he wore a crown of woodland flowers. In hand he held a carven stick of oak. The prisoners were brought before him, and though he looked grimly at them, he told his men to unblindfold them before they ragged and weary. Besides, they need no ropes in here, said he. There is no escape from my magic doors for those who are once brought inside. Long and searchingly he questioned the dwarves about their doings and where they were going to, and where they were coming from. But he got a little more news out of them than out of Thorin. They were surly and angry, and did not even pretend to be polite. "What have we done, O king?" said Balin, who was the eldest left. "It is a crime to be lost in the forest, to be hungry and thirsty, to be trapped by spiders. Are the spiders your tame beasts or your pets, if killing them makes you angry?" Such a question, of course, made the king angrier than ever, and he answered, "It is a crime to wander in my realm without leave. Do you forget that you were in my kingdom, using the road that my people made? Did you not 3 times pursue the trouble of my people in the forest and rouse the spiders with your riot and clamor? After all the disturbance you made, I had a right to know what brings you here, and if it will not tell me now, I will keep you in my prison until you have learned sense and manners. Then he ordered the dwarves each to be put into separate cells and to be given food and drink, but not to be allowed to pass the doors of their little prison until one of them at least was willing to tell him all he wanted to know. But he did not tell them that Thorin was also a prisoner with him. It was Bilbo who found that out. Poor Mr. Baggins. It was a weary long time before that he lived in a place all alone, and always in hiding, never daring to take off his ring, hardly daring to sleep, even tucked away in the darkest, remotest corners he could find. For something to do, he took to wandering about the Elven King's palace. Magic shut the gates, but he could not. But he could sometimes get out if he was quick. Companies of the wood elves, sometimes with the king at hand, would from time to time ride out to hunt, or to otherwise business in the woods and in the lands of the east. Then, if Bilbo was very nimble, he could slip out just behind them. Through it was a dangerous thing to do. More than once he was nearly caught in the doors as they clashed together when the last elf passed. He did not dare to march among them because of the shadow, altogether thin and wobbly as it was in torchlight, or for fear of being bumped into and discovered. And when he did go out, which was not very often, he did no good. He did not wish to be desert to the dwarves. Indeed, he did not know where in the world to go without them. He could not keep up with the hunting of elves all the time that they were out. He never discovered the ways out of the wood, and he was left wandering miserable in the forest, terrified of losing himself, until a chance came of returning. He was hungry, too, outside. He was no hunter, but inside the caves he could pick up a living of some sort of stealing food from the store or the table when no one was at hand. I am like a burglar. They can't get away, but must go on miserably burgling the same house every day. He thought, this is the dreariest and dullest part of all this wretched, tiresome, uncomfortable adventure. I wish I could go back to the hobbit hole of my own warm fireside and the lamp shining. He often wished that too, and he could get a message for help sent to the wizard. But that, of course, was quite impossible, and he soon realized that, if anything was to be done, it would have to be done by Mr. Baggins, alone and unaided. Eventually, after a week or two of the sneaking sort of chances he could, he managed to find out where each dwarf was kept. He found all their 12 cells in different parts of the palace, and after a time he got to know his way about very well. What was his surprise one day to overhear some of the guards talking and to learn that there was another dwarf in prison too, in a specifically deep, dark place. He guessed at once, of course, that this was Thorin, and after a while he found that his guess was right. At last, after many difficulties, he managed to find the place when no one was about, and to have a word with the chief and the chief of the dwarves. Thorin was too wretched to be angry any longer at his misfortunes, and he even beginning to think of telling the king all about his treasures and his quest, which shows how low-spirited he had become. When he heard Bilbo's little voice at the keyhole, he could hardly believe his ears. Soon, however, he made up his mind that he could not be mistaken. And he came to the door and had a long whispered talk with the hobbit on the other side. So it was that Bilbo was able to talk secretly. Hold on. So it was that Bilbo was able to take secretly Thorin's message to each of the other imprisoned dwarves, telling them that Thorin, their chief, was also in prison close at hand, and that no one was to reveal their errand to the king. Not yet. Not before Thorin gave the word. For Thorin had taken heart again, hearing how the hobbit had rescued his companions from the spiders, and was determined once more not to ransom himself with promises to the king of a share in the treasure, until all hope of escaping in any other way had disappeared. Until that fact, the remarkable Mr. Invisible Baggins, of course, of whom he began to have a very high opinion indeed, had altogether failed to think of something clever. The other dwarves quite agreed that they got the message. They all thought that their own shares in the treasure, which were quite regarded as theirs, in spite of their flight and their still unconquered dragon, still suffered seriously, and the wood elves claimed part of it. And they all trusted Bilbo. Just what Gandalf had said would happen. You see, perhaps this was part of the reason for giving off and leaving them. Bilbo, however, did not feel nearly so helpful as they did. He did not like being depended on by everyone. He wished he had a wizard at hand. But that was no use. Probably all the dark distance of Mirkwood lay between them. He sat and thought until his head nearly burst. But no bright idea would come. Oh, invisible ring, what a very fine thing, but it would be much good among the 14. But of course, as you have guessed, he did rescue his friends in the end, and this is how it happened. One day, nosing and wandering about, Bilbo discovered a very interesting thing. The great gates were not the only entrance to the caves. A stream flowed under the part of the lowest region of the palace and joined the forest river some way further to the east. Beyond the steep slope on of which the main mouth opened, there was an underground watercourse come forth from the hillside. There was a water gate. There was a rocky roof came down close to the surface of the stream, and from its portcullis could be dropped right at the bed of the river to prevent anyone coming in or out that way. But the portcullis was often open, for a good deal of traffic went out and in by Watergate, and if anyone had come in that way, he could have found himself a dark, rough tunnel leading down into the heart of the hill. But at one point where it passed under the caves, the roof had been cut away and covered with great oaken trapdoors. These opened upward and into the king's cellars. There stood barrels and barrels and barrels, for the wood elves, and especially for their king, were very fond of wine, though no vines grew in these parts. The wine and other goods were brought in from far away, from their kinfolk in the south, or from the vineyards of men in distant lands. Hiding behind one of the largest barrels, Bilbo discovered that the trapdoors and their use, and lurking there, listened to the talk of the king's servants. He learned how the wine and the other goods came up the rivers, or over land, to Long Lake. It seemed a town of men still thrown there, built out of bridges far from the water, as a protection against enemies of all sorts, and especially against the dragon of the mountain. From Lake Town, the barrels were brought up from the forest river. Often they were just tied together like big rafts and pulled or rowed up the stream. Sometimes they were loaded on by flat boats. When the barrels were empty, the elves would cast them through the trapdoors, open the water gate, and out the barrels floated onto the stream, bobbing along until they were carried by the current to a place far down the river where the bank jutted out, near to the very eastern edge of Mirkwood. There they were collected and tied together and floated back to Lake Town, which stood close to the point where the Forest River flowed into the Lake Wood, into Long Lake. For some time, Bilbo sat and thought about this Watergate and wondered if he could be used for an escape for his friends. And at last, he had a desperate beginning of a plan. The evening meal had just been taken to his prisoners. The guards were tramping away down the passage, taking the torchlights with them and leaving everything in darkness. Then Bilbo heard the king's butler bidding the chief of the guards good night. "Now, come with me," he said, "and taste the new wine that has just come in. I shall be good at work tonight, clearing the cellars of the empty wood. So let's just have a drink first, to help the labor." "Very good," laughed the chief of the guards. "I'll taste with you, and see if it's a good fit for the king's table. There is a feast tonight, and it would not do to send up poor stuff." Then he heard Bilbo. When he heard this, Bilbo was in all a flutter. He had saw that luck was with him, and he had a chance once to try his desperate plan. He followed the two elves until they entered a small cellar and sat down at the table from which two large flagons were set. Soon they began to drink and laugh merrily. Luck of an unusual kind was with Bilbo then. It must be potent wine to make a wood elf drowsy, but the wine, it would seem, was a heady vintage of the great gardens of Dorwinen, which meant that his soldiers or his servants, but the king's feast only, and for smaller bowls, not for the butler's great flagons. Very soon the chief's guard nodded his head, and then laid it on the table and fell fast asleep. The butler went on talking and laughing to himself for a while without seeming to notice, but soon his head nodded off too on the table and fell asleep and snored beside his friend. Then in crept the Hobbit. Very soon the chief's guard had no keys, but Bilbo was trotting as fast as he could along the passage towards the cells. The great bunch seemed very heavy to his arms, and his heart was often in his mouth, in spite of his ring, for he could not prevent the keys from making every now and then a loud clink or clink, which made him tremble. For he unlocked Balin's door and locked it again carefully as soon as the dwarf was outside. Balin was most surprised, as you can imagine, but glad as he was to get out of the wearisome little stone room. He wanted to stop and ask questions and know that Bilbo had what was going to do, and all of that, and all about it. "No time now," said the Hobbit. "You just follow me. We must all keep together and not risk getting separated. All of us must escape, or none. And this is our last chance. If this is found out, goodness knows where the king will put you next, and the chains on your hands and feet too, I expect. Don't argue. There's a good fellow." Then off they went from door to door until his following had grown to 12. None of them any too nimble. With the dark and with the long imprisonment, Bilbo's heart thudded every time one of them bumped into another, or grunted, or whispered in the dark. "Drat this elvish racket," said one of them to himself, and all went well, and they met no guards. As a matter of fact, there was a great autumn feast in the woods that night, and in the halls above. Nearly all the king's folk were merrymaking. At last, after much blundering, they came into Thorin's dungeon, far deep into the deep place, and fortunately not far from the cellars. "Upon my word," said Thorin, when Bilbo whispered to him and came out to join his friends, "Gandalf spoke true as usual. A pretty fine burglar you make, it seems, when the time comes. I am sure we are all forever at your service, whatever happens after this. But what comes next? Bilbo saw that he had time to come to explain his idea, as far as he could, but he did not feel at all sure how the dwarfs could make it. His fears were quite justified, for they did not like it a bit, and started grumbling loudly, in spite of the danger. "We shall be bruised and battered to pieces, and drowned too, for certain," they muttered. "We thought you had some sensible notion where you managed to get hold of keys. This is mad idea." "Very well," said Bilbo, very downcast, and so rather annoyed. "Come along back to your cells, nice, and I will lock you back in again, and you can sit there comfortably and think of a better plan. But I don't suppose I shall ever get a hold of the keys again, even if I feel inclined to try." That was too much for them. They had calmed down. In the end, of course, they had to do just what Bilbo suggested, because it was obviously impossible for them to try and find their own way into the upper hills, or fight their way out the gates that closed with magic. And it was no good grumbling in the passages until they were caught again. So, following the hobbit down into the lowest cellars, they crept. They passed a door through which the chief, guard, and the butler could be seen still happily snoring with smiles upon their faces. The wine of Dorwinion brings deep and pleasant dreams. There would be a different expression on his face if the chief's guard next day, even though Bilbo, before they went on, stole in and kind-heartedly put the keys back on his belt. "That will save him some of the trouble he is in for," said Mr. Baggins to himself. He wasn't a bad fellow, and quite decent to his prisoners. It was a puzzle. It will puzzle them all, too. They will think we had a very long magic to pass through as though lock doors and disappear. Disappear! We had to get busy very quick if this was to happen. Balin was told off to watch the guard and the butler and give warning if they stirred. The rest went on to adjoining cellars with their trapdoors. There was no time to lose. Before long, Bilbo knew some of the elves were under orders to come down to help the butler get the empty barrels through the trapdoors in the stream. There was a fact already standing in the row in the middle of the floors, waiting to be pushed off. Some of them, oops, sorry guys, I have dogs. Some of them were wine barrels, and some were not much use, as they could not easily be opened at the end without a deal of noise, nor could they easily be secured again. But among them were several others that had been used for bringing other stuff, butter, apples, and all sorts of things, to the king's palace. They soon found 13 with room enough for the dwarves. In fact, they were too roomy, and they were climbed in. The dwarves thought anxiously at the shaking and the bumping they could get inside. Then Bilbo did his best to find straw and other stuff to pack in with them, as cozy as they could be managed in a short time. At last 12 dwarves were stowed. Thorin had given a lot of trouble and turned and twisted in his tub and grumbled like a large dog in a small kennel, while Balin, who came last, made a great fuss about his air holes and said it was stifling, and before his lid was on, Bilbo had done what he could to close holes in the sides and the barrels and fix on the lids as safely as they could be managed, and now he was left alone again, running round putting the finishing touches on the packaging, and hoping against hope that his plan would come off. It had not been It had not been done a bit too soon. Only a minute or two after Balin's lid had a had been fitted on, there came a sound of voices and flicker of lights. A number of elves came laughing and talking into the cellars and singing snatches of songs. They were left to merry feast in one of the halls and were bent on returning as soon as they could. "Where's old Galen, the butler?" they said. "I haven't seen him at the tables tonight. He ought to be here now to show us what is to be done." "I shall be angry if the old show coach is late," said another. "I have no wish to waste time down here while the song is up." "Ha ha!" came a cry. "Here's an old villain with his head on a jug. He's been having a little feast all by himself and his friend the captain." "Shake him, wake him," shouted the others impatiently. Galen was not at all pleased at being shaken or wakened, and still less at being laughed at. "You're all late," he grumbled. "Here I am waiting and waiting down here while you fellows drink and make merry and forget your tasks. Small wonder if I fall asleep from the weariness." "Small wonder," they said, when the explanation stands close at hand in a jug. Come give us a taste of your sleeping draught before we fall to. No need to wake the turnkey yonder. He has had his share by the looks of it." Then he drank once more round before mighty merry all of a sudden. But before they were quite but they did not quite lose their wits. "Save us, Galen!" cried some. "You began your feasting early and muddling your wits. You have stacked some full cracks here inside the empty ones. If there is anything in wait, get on with the work," growled the butler. "There is nothing in the feeling of weight in the midst of those pot arms. There are the ones that go and no others. Do as I say." "Very well, very well," they answered, rolling the barrels to the opening. "On the head to be it, if the king's full butter tubs, his best wine is pushed into the river for the lake men to feast on for nothing. Roll, 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 rolling down the hole. Heave ho, splash plump, down they go, down they bump." So they sang the first one barrel and then another, rumbled into the dark opening, and pushed over into the cold water some feet below. Soon, where the barrels really empty, some of the tubs nearly packed with dwarves each, but down all they went, one after another, with many a clash and bump, thudding on the top of ones below, smacking into the water, jostling into the walls of the tunnel, knocking into one another, and bobbing away down the current. It was just at that moment that Bilbo suddenly discovered the weak point in the plan. "Most likely you saw it some time ago, and have been laughing at him. But I don't suppose you would have done half as well yourself in that place. Of course he was not in a barrel himself, nor was there any one to pack him in, even if he had been a chance. It looked as if he would certainly lose his friends this time. Nearly all of them had already disappeared through the trapdoor, and get utterly left behind and have to stay lurking in the apparent burglar in the elf caves forever. For even if he could have escaped through the upper gates at once, he had precious small chances of ever finding the dwarves again. He could not know the way to land to the place where the barrels were collected. He wondered what on earth would happen to them without him. For he had not had time to tell the dwarves all that he had learned, or what he had meant to do once they were out of the wood. While all these thoughts were passing through his mind, the elves began very merry, began to sing a song round the river doors. Some had already gone to haul off the ropes which pulled on the portcullis at the water gate, and so as to let out the barrels as soon as they were all afloat below. Down the swift dark streams you go, back to the lands you once did know. Leave the halls and caverns deep, leave the northern mountains steep, where the forest wide and dim stoops in shadow gray and grim. Float beyond the world of trees, out into whispering breeze, past the brushes, past the reeds, past the marshes waving weeds, through the midst that riseth white, up from mere and pool at night. Follow, follow, stars that leap, up the heavens cold and steep. Turn when down comes over land, dawn when comes over land, over rapid, over sand, south away and south away, seek the sunlight and the day. Back to pasture, back to mead, where the kine and oxen feed. Back to gardens on the hills, where the berry swells and fills. Under sunlight, under day. South away and south away. Down the swift dark stream you go, back to lands you once did know. Now the very last barrel was being rolled out the doors. In despair, and not knowing what else to do, poor little Bilbo caught hold of it, and was pushed over the edge with it. Down into the water he fell, splash, into the cold dark water with the barrel on top of him. He came up again, sputtering and clinging onto the wood like a rat. For all his efforts, he could not scramble on to the top. Every time he tried, the barrel just rolled and ducked him under again. It was really empty and floated like a cork. Though his ears were full of water, he could hear the elves singing and singing in the cellar above. Then suddenly the trapdoors fell with a boom, and their voices faded away. He was in the dark tunnel, floating in icy water all alone. For you cannot count friends that are all packed up in barrels. Very soon a great patch came into the darkness ahead. He heard the creak of the water gate being hauled up, and he found that he was in the midst of a bobbing and bumping mass of cork and tubs, all pressed together to pass under the arch and get out of the open stream. He had as much as he could to do to prevent himself from being hustled and battered to bits, but at least the jostling crowd began to break up and swing off, one by one, under the stony arch and away. Then he saw that in what had been no good, even if he had managed to get astride a barrel, for there was no room to spare, not even for a hobbit, between the tops and then suddenly stopping roof where the gate was. Out they went under the overhanging branches, into the trees on either bank. Bilbo wondered what the dwarves were feeling, and whether a lot of water was getting in their tubs. Some of those were bobbing along by him in the gloom seemed pretty low in the water, and he guessed those were the ones the dwarves were inside. I do hope I put the lids on tight enough, he thought. But before long he was wondering too much about himself to remember the dwarves. He managed to keep his head he managed to keep his head above the water, but he was shivering with cold, and he wondered if he would die of it before his luck turned, and how much longer he would be able to hang on, and whether he should risk the chance of letting go and trying to swim to the bank. Fizzy. Sorry. Luck turned all right before long, and eddying current carried several barrels close ashore at one point, and while they were stuck against one hidden root. Then Bilbo took the opportunity to scramble up to the side of his barrel while it was held steadily against another. Up he crawled like a drowned rat and lay on top, spread out, to keep his balance the best he could. The breeze was cold, but better than the water, and he hoped he would not suddenly roll off again when he started off once more. Before long, the barrels broke free again and turned and twisted down the stream and cut out into the main current. Then he found it quite as difficult to stick on as he had feared, but he managed it somehow, though it was miserably uncomfortable. Luckily, he was very light, and the barrel was a good big one, and being rather leaky, had now slipping a small amount of water. All the same, it was like trying to ride without bridle and stirrups a round-bellied pony that was always thinking of rolling on the grass. That sounds like fun. In this way, at last, Mr. Baggins came to a place where the trees on either hand grew thinner. He could see the paler sky between them. The dark river opened suddenly wide, and there it joined to the main water by the forest river, flowing down into haste from the king's great doors. There was a dim sheet of water, no longer overshadowed, and on its sliding surface there was a dancing and broken reflections of clouds and stars. Then the hurrying water of the forest river swept all the company of the cracks in the tubs away to the north bank, in which had been eaten out a wide bay. This had a shiny shore underhanging banks, and was walled at the eastern end of a little jutting cape of hard rock. On the shallow shore, most of the barrels ran aground, though a few went to bump against the stony pier. Some of the people on the lookout of the banks, they were quickly pulled and pushed into the barrels together into the shallows, and when they all counted them, they roped them together and left them till the morning. Poor dwarves! Bilbo was not badly off now. He slipped from his barrel and waded ashore, and then sneaked along to some huts and could see near the water's edge. He had no longer thought twice about picking up supper uninvited if he had the chance. He had been obliged to do so for so long that he knew only too well what it would be to be really hungry, not merely politely interested in the dainties of a well-filled larder. Also, he had caught a glimpse of a fire through the trees, and that appealed to him, and his dripping and ragged clothes clinging to him, cold and clammy. There is no need to tell you much of his adventures that night, for now we are drawing near the end of the eastern journey and coming to the land of the greatest adventure. So we must carry on. Of course, helped by his magic ring, we got on very well at first, but he was given away in the end by his wet footsteps and the trail of drippings that he had left wherever he went and sat. And also he began to snivel. And whenever he tried to hide, he found out by the terrific expressions of his suppressed sneezes. Very soon there was a very fine commotion in the village by the riverside, but Bilbo escaped into the woods carrying a loaf and leather bottle of wine and a pie that did not belong to him. The rest of the night he had passed wet, as he was far from the fire, and the bottle helped him to do that, and he actually dozed a little on some dry leaves, even though the year was getting late and the air was chilly. He woke again with a specially loud sneeze. It was already gray morning, and there was a merry racket down by the river. They were making up rafts with the barrels, and the raft elves would soon be steering it off down the stream to Lake Town. Bilbo sneezed again. He was no longer dripping, but he was cold all over. He scrambled down fast as his stiff legs could take him, and managed just in time to get to the massing of casks without being noticed in the nearest bustle. Luckily, there was no sun at all this time to cast an awkward shadow, and for a merry he did not sneeze again for a good while. There was a mighty pushing of poles. The elves that were standing in shallow water, heaved and shoved the barrels now at lashed together and creaked and fretted. "This is a heavy load," some grumbled. "They float too deep. Some of these are never empty, and they had some ashore in the daylight. We might have had a look inside," they said. "Nah, no time now," cried the raftmen. "Shove off." And off they went at last, slowly at first, until they had paused the point of rock where the other elves stood to fend them off with poles, and then quicker and quicker as they caught the main stream, when sailed away down towards the lake. They had escaped the dungeons of the king and were through the woods, but whether alive or dead still remains to be seen. Good night, guys.